Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on waking up to better sleep. I'm Josh Kovoor. I'm a doctor in the NHS, and I have a specialist interest in sleep medicine. So I'm really delighted to be here today to be talking to you on one of my favorite subjects, which is sleep, and a topic which I think will probably have some relevance to all of you here today. Before I get going, just a reminder that within the session inbox that you're in at the moment, you should have a question and answer section on the right hand side of the screen. So as we go through the talk, do feel free to drop in any questions that you might have, and we'll get to those. There'll be plenty of time for question and answer at the end. So the first question I really want to ask, though, when we start this topic is, why are you here? Because my guess is that at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, there are plenty of other things that you could be doing. If you're like the thousands of patients that I see in my NHS practice, you have busy lives, you probably have commitments, you may have ambitions. And so it takes something to take, an hour, which is precious time out of your day, to sit down in front of a screen and watch a boring old doctor like me talk about sleep. But I'd argue that, that it's that whole tiredness and sluggishness and fatigue and overwhelm that comes with our busy lives that may well be the reason that you are here today. Maybe you've got brain fog, maybe you're sleepy in the day, or you wake up in the mornings and you don't feel rested, or maybe you've got no sleep problem whatsoever, but you're just not operating at 100%. And so today, my hope is for two things. Number one is to keep you alert and awake throughout the 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock session that we have now. I've got no excuses, because really you should be at your peak alertness right now. And the second is to give you some real practical strategies to allow you to go home and start getting a better night's sleep from tonight and the nights going forward. Because I think intuitively at the heart of it, we know there's something special about sleep. We know there's something special about sleep, even if we don't know exactly what it is. And we know that it might just hold the answer to those problems, that fatigue, that overwhelm, that stress, that brain fog that we have. My wife actually said to me yesterday, there's just something absolutely delicious about getting an amazing night's sleep. You wake up in the morning and you feel so rested. My hope is that some of you have felt that at some point, even if it's not every night. And in order to answer this question, well, what's so special about sleep? We have to think a little bit about what is sleep in the first place. Well, it's quite simple, isn't it? This is a man who's clearly lying down, eyes closed, and he's not moving, so surely he's asleep. The truth is, we don't really know that about this person. He could be pretending, he could just be resting, he could be sedated or drugged into a state of semi consciousness, he could have passed out. He might be in a coma. In fact, he might not be actually alive. And so, yes, whilst sleep is often seen with lying down, eyes closed, not moving, that's not really what it is. Sleep is an altered level of consciousness and a reduced awareness of our surroundings, but sleep couldn't be further from the idea of just being reduced brain and reduced body activity. Behind the scenes, in the brain and in the body, there is this symphony of biological activity going on, and that's what I want to explore a little bit today. So just if you can imagine a thriving ecosystem on the ocean floor, a coral reef with all sorts of fish and other animal organisms that are going on under the surface, sleep is not so much about less, but about different. And it's amazing. I might be biased, but it is amazing. Every living cell in our body is engaged in a different sort of process, and that's what we're going to explore today. In fact, there are some parts of our brain and body that are more active in sleep than they are in awake. But if you think about it, there's an enormous cost to this state of being asleep. Just look at this man again. Look how very vulnerable he is in this state. If we think about it from an evolutionary point of view, imagine us being in a state where we could be attacked by a lion or a bear at any moment. Sleep is an incredibly vulnerable state. So much so that if sleep does not serve an absolutely vital function, then it is the biggest mistake that the evolutionary process ever made. Think about it. This state of being uh, so vulnerable to attack, given the fact we spend a third of our lives asleep, probably seems to the casual observer like a massive waste of time. So, why do we do it? Really, the answer is we don't know. We really don't know why we sleep. What we do know is that there are certain biological processes that are going on in the background, and we know that these are amazingly beneficial for our body. We're going to talk through these one by one. The purpose of this section is not at all for you to memorize any of the things we're about to talk about, but do take it in and try and understand the importance of sleep as we go along, because that's where the key lies in improving your own sleep. So, the more that you can internalize the importance of sleep and the amazing things that it does, even if you don't remember the specifics, the better you are likely to take it to heart and put it into action in your day to day lives. So, let's start with attention, memory, and learning. So, just one night of poor sleep increases your reaction times and makes you accident prone. Studies show that our attention becomes erratic. Sometimes it's fine, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's dangerously slow. And we know that participants who have less than 6 hours of sleep on a nightly basis will spend excessive time doing simple tasks. They have reduced efficiency in everyday life. So, if you can imagine that state of if you've ever read a book and just reading one line over and over and over again, but imagine that times 1,000, spending double the amount of time doing simple chores instead of doing the things that you really want to do, spending time with family and loved ones, getting real work done. In addition, we see that there is this overall slowing of reaction times. So, attention deficits build across consecutive days of sleep deprivation. So, if you were to have one night of poor sleep or restricted sleep, and then you do it again the next night and the next night, we see this dose dependent reduction in vigilance and attention. And this is obviously really, really important in vigilance critical tasks, things like driving, paying attention. And of course, this is so relevant in the rail sector, rail industry, that we need to be paying close attention to this particular aspect of sleep. Well, the good news is the opposite applies. Increasing our sleep quantity, improving our sleep quality, improves our vigilance and our attention. What we see, interestingly, is that performance impairment when you're sleep deprived is greatest in the early to late morning, and that's after a long night awake. So actually, although you do naturally have a peak in the early morning of your attention, that will quickly dip. And your attention will suffer dramatically if you've had a bad night's sleep the night before. So that's the early to late morning. And here's the other interesting thing that in my life as a sleep doctor, I've become fascinated by. There have been studies in those who have tried to stay awake as long as possible. And some people have claimed that they've stayed awake 5, 6, 7, 8 days in a row without any sleep. What we've actually found is that these people have actually been sleeping. They're little islands of their brain, small clusters of their brain that have actually been asleep, even when that person has believed themselves to be fully awake. So this is what we call micro sleeps. And if there is a micro sleep in a part of your brain that is responsible for crucial vigilance critical activity, that can be really problematic. And we'll finally talk about memory. Different stages of sleep, and we'll talk about this in a minute, do different jobs. You may have heard of deep sleep. Well, deep sleep is a stage of sleep that occurs 50, 60 minutes into sleep, a bit later perhaps, in which it acts like a filing system. It's got amazing range of activities. It clears out lots of waste products of your sleep, but it also stabilizes and organizes new information. So, from a memory point of view, if you have learned something a day before, a night of good sleep will allow that to be filed away in the correct parts of your brain without a problem. And there's a different type of sleep called REM sleep, which some of you might have heard of, which also then optimizes those files. So it refiles them, it connects them to existing parts of your brain and makes new connections that you might not have otherwise made when you were awake. Let's talk about emotional regulation. What if I told you that you had a professional therapist built into your brain, like truly the world's best therapist? Well, whether or not you think you're good with your feelings, your sleeping brain does this on autopilot throughout the night. The flip side to this is that without sleep, we may be more at risk of losing emotional control and not regulating our emotions properly. So, again, we'll talk about sleep stages in just a moment, but there is a part of sleep called REM sleep. And in REM sleep, your brain literally takes these emotions and diffuses them. These highly charged, ready to explode emotions that you may have built up during the daytime, it takes them, things that you may not even be aware of that you've been carrying with you, and it unleashes them in your sleep in a really safe way, in a way that it pulls away the thinking part of your brain from the emotional part of your brain, such that the emotion can get processed without being wrapped up in a response of you having to ruminate and get anxious about things when you wake up the next day. We've seen that a stressful event from today becomes less emotionally charged overnight. And in particular, there's a section of the brain, the amygdala, which is typically associated with fear. And so we think of it as the alarm bell in your brain. It literally quietens down in REM sleep, whilst the more rational control centers do re engage. So, what we have here is you do have the emotional intensity of sleep. I talked about parts of the body and brain being more awake during sleep than they are in wake, and this is one of those times where we still have a huge emotional response in our sleep, but it's being handled in a really appropriate and safe way by our brain. The third is our brain's own waste disposal system. So let me talk you through this. In 2013, there was a researcher by the name of Maken Nedergaard, and her team published something completely new. This is something that they termed the glymphatic system, a part of the brain, a system within the brain that basically acts as a cleanup system. This is literally something we never knew about before. Whilst you sleep, there is this system, the glymphatic system, which is washing over your brain, particularly in deep stages of sleep. And it's washing out waste products that have been built up during the day. What do I mean by waste products? Well, when we are awake, in everyday life, unfortunately, our brain, as a part of metabolic processes and the activity that it does, accumulates some waste products. We have waste products all over our body, typically that our kidneys pee out. But unfortunately, the brain has its own separate system. Um, and we found that this glymphatic system is highly active, specifically in sleep. So it is not anywhere near as active in wake. Even if you are resting, eyes closed, it does not activate. It is only in the deepest stages of sleep that we see this brain being washed over with cerebrospinous fluid, clearing out toxins. And there has been some association seen with the chemicals and the proteins seen in conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's, where there is typically a buildup of a harmful protein that accumulates in the brain and can lead to dementia, Alzheimer's. And what we see is that the glymphatic system may well have its own role in getting rid of these toxins. So a good night of sleep, in particular getting the early part of your sleep, can massively benefit your glymphatic system, your waste clearance center. Immune functioning. So on a weekly basis, I have patients who are concerned that they are having infection after infection after infection, and that they are just not bouncing back anywhere as quickly as they would like and as they would expect. And whilst most of the time the body's immune system is functioning perfectly fine and is strong enough to handle things, what we see is that sleep is an absolutely essential training ground for the immune system. With a good night's sleep, the first thing that happens is that certain immune cells that we call T cells and B cells, they reduce their number in the bloodstream and they move to centers around your neck and under your armpits that we call lymph nodes. And these are where immune memory is stored, and these are like the houses of your immune system. And this is really deliberate from sleep. So, sleep is redirecting all of your immune cells to where they need to learn and remember from past experiences of the daytime. So, if you've come into contact, which you will have, of hundreds and hundreds of viruses and bacteria, thousands in fact, uh, sleep is a time in which that processing and that memory occurs of your immune system. What we see specifically in things like vaccinations is that getting a good 7.5 hours of sleep the night after a vaccination, the next day we see that the immune response is doubled compared to staying awake all night. So not just getting a vaccination is what matters. It's also what comes after that. So a good night's sleep really, really matters. We also see that with a poor night's sleep, so just after 3 nights of getting 4.5 hours of sleep, which may in fact be something that many of you are getting, we see increased levels of inflammatory markers, something called IL-6 and C-reactive protein or CRP. And these are the same inflammatory markers that can cause joint pains, generalized fatigue, and these are maybe very real symptoms for some of you here. There was another piece of research in 2015 by a researcher called Dr. Eric Prather in the USA. He showed that people sleeping just less than 6 hours per night were markedly more likely to develop a clinically verified cough and cold, rather, you know, and this is after having been vaccinated. So fifthly, what we're going to talk about is energy conservation. Now, this might be what comes to mind for most of you immediately when you think of sleep. Sleep is about recharging, getting back the energy that we've expent during the daytime. And to a degree, this is correct. There's some truth in this because most of our body systems do slow down during sleep in a state of reduced activity. Our heart rate slows, our gut function slows, and if you think about it, our whole skeleton, our muscles are rested as that we lie down and we take the gravitational force off them. This is a time for our energy currency to be built up again in our system. This is largely by the restorative processes of building up our energy currency in our body, which we call ATP or adenosine triphosphate. Again, I'm not expecting you to remember any of the details of this. Just try and get a feel for the importance of the amazing things that sleep is doing behind the scenes. And finally, let's talk about tissue regeneration. This sounds kind of futuristic, but every night we are having a process of tissue regeneration happening all over our body. As you live your life, as I mentioned, we have natural toxins building up. We have DNA damage that occurs during the daytime, just as a natural consequence of being alive, being exposed to radiation from the sun. So the very genetic code that makes you who you are actually gets damaged throughout the day. And it is only really in sleep that this DNA is effectively repaired. You need really at least 6 hours of continuous sleep to normalize DNA damage that is accumulated during the daytime. Um, when I talk about numbers, I've talked about less than 4 hours, less than 6 hours, less than 7 hours. When I talk about numbers like this is usually based on population level data, which we have. So it's not necessarily unique to you. We can come on to that a bit later. The other thing that happens in terms of tissue regeneration in sleep is that there is this massive spike in growth hormone. Now, growth hormone you may associate with performance athletes or illicit substance use for people who are using it as a performance enhancing drug. But growth hormone is intrinsic to you. We all have a secretion of it. And we see the greatest secretion of growth hormone in deep stages of sleep, in slow wave sleep. And this is where your body signals tissue repair, muscle growth, and cellular regeneration. We see that a single night of disrupted sleep reduces this growth hormone by up to 30%. So it's quite significant. And muscle protein synthesis is also happening. What we see is that in sleep, you have a build up and restorative properties and a decrease in uh, cortisol, which is a stress hormone that can reduce the ability of the body to regenerate and to heal. So let's quickly touch on sleep stages because this isn't a science lesson. We need you to take away something useful from this. But Your sleep is roughly split into N1, N2, and 3 stages of sleep. And we're going from N1, which is a light stage of sleep, down to N3, a deep stage of sleep. And that's all you really need to know. But there is this other stage of sleep called REM sleep. And REM sleep you may have heard of. What is it? REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep, and it only really takes up about 20% of a normal night's sleep. So you're not meant to be getting 50-60% of REM sleep, nor are you meant to be getting 50-60% of deep sleep. Again, deep sleep is only meant to be about 20% of your night. So the first thing is to say the amount of deep sleep you may think you need is actually not as much as you do need. You need about 20% of your night to be deep sleep, about 20% of your night to be REM sleep. What we do naturally is cycle through these stages, N1, N2, N3, the deepest stages of sleep, back up into this lighter but very active stage of sleep that we call REM sleep. And this cycle just continues throughout the night. We should ideally be having 4 or 5 cycles of this per night, and each cycle lasts about 90 minutes on average. So that's all we're really going to talk about here. The only other thing I want you to notice in this slide is on the right-hand side, you can see these sleep cycles mapped out over the course of a roughly 8-hour night. And at the bottom of the diagram is these little blue segments where it says NREM 3 or 4. These are the deepest stages of sleep. And you'll see that most of that happens in the early part of the night, whereas REM sleep, which is denoted by the red, happens toward the later stages of the night on average. Keep that in the back of your mind, because when we disrupt our sleep, or if we go to bed too late, or if we wake too early, we may be selectively chopping off these really important parts of our sleep. So here's the good news. The system is completely on autopilot. You don't have to do anything. So surely that's the end of the talk. That's got to be the end, right? Not quite. For we know that for most of us, we do have a bad night of sleep occasionally. And for some of us, that sleep problem may be a chronic thing. And we think, hang on a second, my sleep is not on autopilot. I just can't quite seem to get a hold of it. And I'm not waking up restored. I'm not waking up refreshed. So, what might be going on? Well, let us go back to this idea of sleep being on autopilot. Sleep is automatic, but we need to understand it just a little bit more than that. So, sleep is automatic. It's an essential and inescapable part of who we are. It occurs automatically, and it's governed by these really complex processes going on behind the scenes, some of which we've just talked about. So, although it is complex, and although I'm saying it's automatic, it does not need to be treated with complexity. What we do need to do is respect it. So, just like as if we had a house plant, the houseplant grows by itself. And for the most part, it does what it needs to. What we need to do is to look at it, understand what it needs, and then to be able to give it what it needs and to nurture it and allow it to thrive on its own. Now, this is the final part of my brief science lesson up to this point, and I promise you we're going to get onto some real practical strategies here. But there are only 2 systems that you really need to remember. So all of the stuff we've talked about before, you don't need to remember it. It's just good to know, because education is agency. Education is the power to be able to make those good decisions. However, if you try and remember the next 5 minutes of what I'm about to say, it will really stand you in good stead to be able to tackle whatever comes next. So there are 2 systems that make you sleepy. The only 2 systems you need to remember are your circadian rhythm, this clock, and something called sleep pressure. So let's talk about this one by one. So your circadian rhythm, you may well have heard about. Your circadian rhythm comes from a Greek word meaning circa diem, meaning roughly 24 hours. These are biological clocks that live inside all of us that typically regulate when you're awake and when you need to go to sleep. They are automatic. They run by themselves, whether you like it or not, they will be running in the background. And the amazing thing about circadian rhythms is they are not just about sleep and wake. They live in every single cell in your body. So the sleep and wake centers in your brain, yes, but also when we're talking about our appetite and our feeding schedules, circadian rhythm is really responsible for your feelings of hunger or feelings of satiety and being full. It's also responsible for the ebb and flow of our stress hormones throughout the day. And why do we have stress hormones? Well, those stress hormones are often the same ones that help us feel mentally alert. But if they peak at the wrong times, then those stress hormones can make us feel sluggish and drained. So your circadian rhythm is really important from a stress hormone point of view as well. We've talked about immune responses and our immune function relating to sleep, but our immune function has its own circadian process such that it peaks in the morning and it's really active overnight, and then its activity changes throughout the day as well. And we've talked about tissue recovery as well, which again is often a nighttime process, but a function of our circadian rhythm. The interesting thing about circadian rhythms is that these clocks keep running by themselves, but they are heavily influenced by environmental factors. And we're going to talk about some of those environmental factors in a brief moment. But the one that you really need to remember is light. Light is a incredible influencer and refiner of our circadian rhythms. And it's something that we can use to our advantage to make sure our circadian rhythms stay really, really strong. The second is sleep pressure. So if you look at this little image of the balloon down in the bottom right, you'll see that sleep pressure is just like a balloon. Sleep pressure is the idea that as you wake up in the morning, you have a little balloon that hasn't yet been filled. And as you blow it up during the daytime, through being awake, through being active, this balloon just fills and fills and fills and fills with the pressure to fall asleep. Let's go through that again. So sleep pressure is this idea that as you are awake, as you are up and about doing your day to day activities, in the background, there is this drive to sleep, which builds and builds and builds and builds and builds until you reach the end of the day, in which there is a sudden collapse of that sleepiness pressure and it sends you right into sleep. So, this, on the other hand, does rely on your activity. It does rely on you being up and about, moving, getting on with day to day activities. And as we do this, there is a neurochemical that we see, adenosine, that builds up in the brain. And this is the sleepy chemical that we're seeing build up in the daytime that is associated with sleep pressure. So, the interesting thing, and the reason I put a picture of coffee on the bottom right hand side, is that caffeine within coffee actually blocks these adenosine receptors in the brain. It blocks the ability for this sleepy chemical in the brain to have its effect, and therefore it delays the onset of sleep. But sleep will always win. And so those are the two ideas I really want you to just remember. So you've got your circadian process and your sleep pressure process. The science lesson is shortly about to finish, but this is what I want you to etch into your brain so that we can go forward from here. So in red is your circadian rhythm, this cycle which comes and goes, wakes you up and sends you into sleep, wakes you up and sends you into sleep on a nightly cyclical pattern. It goes on, it carries on, somewhat with the influence of getting good daylight around you. Sleep pressure is the blue line, this idea that you waking active, it's building, 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 and then it dramatically falls off quickly and sends you into sleep. So these two processes work together to send you to sleep, and they work together to give you that sense of the ability to be awake and do day-to-day tasks. This is a model that has been validated and confirmed over the years since the 1980s. So we're really confident that these are the two main factors going on. But this takes us to our first real take home point, which is that your wake time is much more important than your bedtime. So let's bring it back to those principles we just learned about. Your wake time is so much more important than your bedtime because when you wake up in the morning and you set a wake time, what you are doing is you're telling your body, number one, circadian rhythm, this is your time to get up and go. It's morning time, it's wake time, it's go time. Knowing that sends your circadian rhythm a really strong signal to be awake, to stay awake, for all of those other circadian processes, your feeding schedules, your immune function, to take a cue from your wake signal and to say, okay, let's all get going, let's all work together to stay awake and be awake. What you notice with the circadian rhythm is that when it's got a really strong cue in the morning to be awake, it doesn't have too much of a problem in the evening falling asleep. So you don't need to worry about setting a bedtime because your bedtime might just be wrong. You might set it too early, you might set it too late. What is a much better idea is if you set a really strong wake time and if you really train your body to have a strong wakefulness drive, then your sleep time and your bedtime will just take care of itself. That's the circadian side of things. And if you think about the sleep pressure side of things, the balloon, when you wake up at a particular time, has a great opportunity to just fill and fill and fill and fill, such that at the end of the day, when it is time for bed, it is nice and tight and full, and it can just collapse on itself and send you right to sleep. That is why when people come to me and say, I've been trying to get into bed every day, I'm trying to get into bed at around 10 p.m. or 9:30, that's what I've heard is the right thing to do. We say, well, everyone's a little bit different. What time do you wake up in the morning? Because your wake time, more often than not, is a combination of your tendency to be awake, but it's also set by other people. Sometimes you have to wake up at a certain time to get the kids ready, to get ready for work. And your wake time is often not as in your control as your bedtime. So if it's not, and we have a regularity with your wake time, then you don't need to worry about your bedtime. And so we briefly talked about this, but the principle too is that we need strong signals for wake. And if we get strong signals for wake in the daytime, that also sends a strong signal for sleep. We talked about the complex things that happen all over the body and during sleep and during wake, and how a lot of this relates to this predictable cycle, this circadian rhythm. In order for the circadian rhythm to keep sending this clear and regular signal, it needs to be given regularity. And it needs to be regularity of a very clear, very strong signal that it knows to look to. And as I speak, the sun is shining in through my window here, and what that does is when I'm outside on a nice, bright, sunny day, that is sending my circadian rhythm a crystal clear signal. It is awake. Get ready. Let's get the day going. Again, to the point that when nighttime rolls around, you're not really relying on lots of other cues in the nighttime to send you to sleep. You may have those cues, you may have darkness, you may have other things, but your signal for sleep is much better dependent on strong signals for wake during the daytime. As I'm talking through this, what I'm trying to do is take the emphasis off your bedtime. Try and take the emphasis off your sleep time, because sleep is automatic, as I said. So the less we can think about it, the better it will be for your sleep overall. But we still need to nurture this houseplant. We still need to give it what it needs in order for it to function well. Let's talk about light just briefly, shall we? So light is a drug. Yeah, you heard that absolutely right. Light is a drug. It's not one that I prescribe in my clinical practice as a general practitioner, um, but it does have a very biologically active signal to our brains and to our body, which can create a specific response. So if we try and remember back to our school science lessons, you may remember that white light is made up of all of the colors of the rainbow. Not only does this light reach our eyes to be able to help us see the colors in things around us and to see depth, but it also has invisible effects too. So specifically light within a blue range at around 480 nanometers. So if you look on this rainbow spectrum that we have in front of us, the spectrum of visible light, if you look towards the bluish range, you'll see that around 480 nanometers on the scale, that's where blue light is. And that's where we often do have a peak in natural daylight spectrum of light. What we know, though, is that that particular wavelength of light has a very strong effect on our biological systems, specifically on our system to suppress a sleepiness hormone, melatonin. What it does also is sends a really clear signal for us to be awake. So what we want is we want good quality, strong signals of light early in the morning to send a very strong signal to be awake. And we want to minimize daylight or any sort of strong white light towards bedtime. And in doing so, we're really feeding our circadian system exactly what it needs. We talked about feeding schedules in terms of circadian rhythm. Let's dig down a little bit deeper into that. So, circadian rhythms are influenced by food, the quality of our food, the quantity of our food, the regularity of our food, and the timing of our food. And we see this in a variety of ways. So, however appetizing that burger on the right looks to you, it certainly does to me, and I'll put my hands up and be the first one to say that. We know that there is a certain composition of food that perhaps will not feed our gut microbiome as well as other things. And we know that the gut microbiome has a very specific influence on our ability to sleep. So, the gut microbiome is this constellation of trillions of organisms that live in our gut and help us function on a day to day basis. They are active bacteria, viruses, and lots of other things that help our biological systems function properly. It might seem a bit strange to think that you have trillions of organisms living inside you and are constantly active during the daytime, but we know that they are essential for a variety of processes, including sleeping well and waking well. And we know that a large, unhealthy, or fatty meal is very unlikely to provide our gut microbiome with what it needs. There is no set diet that you need to adopt. But what we see is that if you have a great variety of foods, in particular foods that have lots of whole grains, lots of fiber, and if you adopt what is called the Mediterranean diet, it's very likely to stand you in good stead to give your gut microbiome what it needs to allow these cycles of sleep and wake, of feeding and fullness to occur in a really nice rhythm. What we also see with feeding schedules is if you give your body a really good signal for when it needs to eat and give it a consistent schedule to eat on time, then this also regulates two important hormones in the body that we call leptin and ghrelin. Now, ghrelin is your hunger hormone. Ghrelin, when ghrelin peaks, it sends a signal to your body to say, I'm really hungry. When leptin is increased, we see that it kicks in our satiety centers. That means our feeling of fullness. And so, certain foods and a regular food schedule ensures that that balance and regulation of leptin and ghrelin, of feeling full or feeling hungry, is kept in really good balance. What we don't want, and what we see in those who have sleep deprivation, is that there is a dysregulation of these hunger hormones, such to the point that if you have a poor night's sleep, it makes you excessively hungry in the daytime and excessively hungry for foods that are fatty, starchy, and what we call obesogenic. So, more likely to give you obesity and type 2 diabetes. And so, as a weight loss strategy, there's real merit on top of having a good balanced diet and a good exercise regime to be able to ensure that if you get a good quality night of sleep and you have regularity with your sleep time, you are most likely to be able to protect that. Let's touch on caffeine very briefly. Caffeine is everywhere. Caffeine is in chocolate, it's in coffee, it's in places you would never expect. And we mentioned that caffeine blocks this effect of the sleepy chemical adenosine. It can delay and disrupt your sleep onset. And as I mentioned, energy drinks, coffee, teas, they can all contain caffeine. Herbal teas, not so much, but green tea does. And you may also see caffeine crop up in things like cough and flu medications, where it has an effect on helping improve the effects of pain medications. And you may also find it in pre workout supplements. So be aware of the hidden effects of caffeine and the hidden places that caffeine can live, including cough and cold medicines. The advice is really to avoid caffeine in the 10 hours, ideally, but let's say in the 8 hours or 6 hours before bedtime. It is not about rule keeping here, but it's about being aware that what you don't want is caffeine within 3, 4 hours of bedtime, because that will still have an effect on your sleep. Exercise. is beneficial for sleep. Let's be clear about that. It builds sleep pressure, as we talked about. It builds this balloon, but it also, we know that it's in big population studies, cardiovascular training, resistance training, it's beneficial and it's encouraged for your overall well-being, but also for your sleep. So whether that's low or moderate or high intensity exercises, this can all build your sleep drive. And 150 minutes of moderate intensity sleep exercise per week is what is recommended. What you really want to do is not cram all of 150 minutes into one part of the week. You want to have some regularity on a daily basis. So, a daily habit of exercise, whether that's a half an hour walk around the block, that is certainly something your body will respond well to. And when it comes round to sleep, will have recognized that good effect of the exercise during the daytime. There was at one point a lot of thinking that if you exercise too close to bedtime, it's going to be really disruptive to sleep. What we find is that that isn't so much the case anymore. We know that, yes, if you have very, very high intensity exercise before bedtime, that might disrupt your sleep. But the advice really is if you finish moderate intensity exercise at least 2 hours before bed, if you finish any high intensity exercise 3 to 4 hours before bed, you should be fine. And I lied. There aren't just two sleep process. There is one more that we need to be aware of. And this is something that is probably going to be familiar to all of you, the voluntary ability to stay awake. So if you think about it, New Year's Eve has just gone by. How many of you stayed up? Even if you didn't, if you really wanted to, you probably could have. That's our voluntary system for sleep and wakefulness. We're not saying that you can voluntarily tell yourself to sleep and it will happen just like that. Sleep doesn't respond to pressure, or sleep doesn't respond to being told what to do. It cannot be forced. But when we voluntarily stay awake, we often reduce our optimal sleep time. And this is most commonly seen in what we call voluntary sleep restriction or poor sleep habits, where we push ourselves just that little bit longer to stay awake. And related to this, anxiety, you might say, well, no, my anxiety is not a voluntary thing. I'm not telling myself to be anxious. But it comes from the same system in which our sleep is being overridden by a process of anxiety, telling our body that it needs to stay awake, then it needs to be on high alert. So this state of anxiety is often associated with high vigilance in the bedroom, whether that's entering your dark bedroom, whether it's getting into bed. Our bedrooms, for some of us, can be linked to a state of increased awareness and anxiety. And that's often this voluntary system which is overriding and sort of disrupting our circadian pressure systems. Here's the good news, though. The circadian system and the pressure system are very robust, so they will always win. They will always overcome our desire to stay awake. I want to talk about the buffer zone because this is how one of these strategies that we can reduce the sort of intrusion on sleep. So the buffer zone is just simply 1 to 2 hours before bed, dedicating some time to winding down. It's when your body, your mind transition from wakefulness into getting ready for sleep. The evidence is pretty clear. What you do in those hours before sleep directly predicts how you're going to feel and how quickly you'll fall asleep when you sleep. So we're talking work, emails, intense planning or discussions, basically anything that keeps your brain on go, admin, worries, discussions. These all need to happen before the buffer zone. The buffer zone is for gentle, relaxing activities, reading a book, light stretching, meditation, a warm bath, maybe a herbal non-caffeinated tea. And the key is consistency here. The same routine every night, again, signals to your body that sleep is about to happen. And when we build this buffer zone, we're building a bridge from our awake state down into our sleep state. I've put loungewear at the top. Something as simple as what you're wearing in the pajamas or the loungewear you're getting into is also a really nice way of transitioning from the period of the daytime into the night. And let's finally touch on shift work. So shift work is not ideal, but for some it's unavoidable. What we want to do is we want to opt for a 7 to 9 hours sleep roughly across a 24-hour period. Everyone's a little bit different. So you'll have to figure out what works for you. But you want to give yourself an opportunity to sleep, and you want to protect it. You want to plan it, you want to block it out, and let others know that it's a priority. So before and during and after your shifts, you want to use light to your advantage. Bright light during the first half of a night shift to stay alert, darker and softer lighting towards the end of the shift. And if possible during a shift, taking a planned nap, just 20 minutes or so, should improve your overall alertness during work and allow you to still get to sleep at the end of your shift. I'm aware that I want to get straight to question and answer because there's probably a lot of questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move to the next slide, which is our question and answer slide, but we'll come back to this in just a second. Okay, any questions and answers? Any questions for us? Okay, great. So we've got lots of questions on the screen. We'll try and start with the ones that are the most popular questions. So is there anything I can do to reduce waking up in the middle of the night, and tips for getting back to sleep, more restful sleep? Yes, there is. And it really boils down to reinforcing your two sleep systems, your circadian rhythm and your sleep pressure. That's the first thing. So the first thing you want to do if you're waking up in the middle of the night is, number one, ask, is there a particular reason? Is it a noise outside? Is it light from outside? Is it a snoring bed partner? Is it an internal sense of overheating? Is it getting up to go to the toilet? Now, if it's a physical symptom, it might be worth you going and seeing your doctor. Occasionally, waking up in the middle of the night can be a symptom of an underlying medical problem, which on this talk, unfortunately, I can't give you direct medical advice, but just keep that in the back of your mind. Are you waking up gasping for breath? Are you having odd symptoms that you think you need to explore? And if that's the case, just being able to think through that first, take it to your doctor and discuss, is a good first step. If you believe that you are having what is chronic insomnia, of waking up feeling like you just can't get back to sleep, a simple strategy that is often employed is the idea of getting out of bed, moving to a totally different room, and giving yourself time to just do something else. Remember, sleep can't be forced. So there is no good lying in bed awake. All that will be doing is sending a signal to your brain that when you're in bed, you're awake. And what happens with some people over time, particularly in those who have chronic insomnia, if they're waking up lots in the nighttime and thinking, oh my goodness, I need to get more sleep, this is going to be terrible, is that they end up staying in bed. And that actually reduces their ability to have further night's sleep. So there are lots of reasons and details about why this works, but the simple strategy for those with chronic insomnia who are waking up in the middle of the night is to move to a different room and do something else, something enjoyable, something that will take your mind off it. And at some point in the nighttime, you may well feel sleepy again, and you say, I'm ready to get back into to bed. And you get back into bed. And if you fall asleep, you do. And if you don't, you don't. Again, I would encourage you to talk to a clinician, talk to someone who may be trained in helping with these sorts of issues. Right. What are your thoughts on the best posture for sleep? Back, side, front, or does it not matter very much? I'm really glad that you included that last point in your question. Does it not matter very much? For the majority of people, it doesn't matter very much. The people in whom it does matter are people who may have chronic back pains. So, for example, those who sleeping on their back may cause significant worsening of their back pain, which is then going to disrupt their sleep further. These people may prefer to sleep on their sides, or even if they're natural back sleepers, having something that props them up onto their sides might be helpful. There is not a huge amount of robust evidence to say that everyone needs to be sleeping on their sides. There is a particular condition, obstructive sleep apnea, which is a medically important condition that you should go and see a doctor about if you've got any concerns about having, in which intermittently in the nighttime your airway may close. And we see that in sleep apnea, often in a lying flat on your back position, that sleep apnea can worsen. So in those individuals, in some cases, positional therapy and moving onto your side to side sleep can be helpful. There are also other ear, nose, and throat conditions that people may have that can be problematic. I've got another question. I often wake around 4 a.m., feel like I can get up, but um, I often wake around 4 a.m., feel like I could get up, but do get back to sleep because it's too early. Then I struggle to get up at 6 a.m., I guess because of broken sleep. Is this normal? Do you have any tips for me? My suggestion here is that because this is probably a situation that's slightly more unique to you, you need sort of personalized medical advice. And so, unfortunately, I can't really answer that in the depth that I'd like to. But I'd like to say that if you have concerns about that, see your doctor. There are some people in whom a really early waking schedule is normal for them. And this brings us to the idea of some of us being early birds naturally and some of us being night owls. There are some people in the population who are really early birds, who their biological clock, their circadian rhythm wakes them up around 4 o'clock in the morning. That is not the majority of people out there. So some people who say they're an early bird are probably not as much of an early bird as they think they are. And some people who say they're night owls are not as much of a night owl as they think they are. Let's talk about any tips for getting out of the habit of repeatedly hitting snooze in the morning. So, one of the things that is really important to recognize here is that if you train your sleep system really well, you may not even need a morning alarm clock. If your sleep system is so robust that it works on autopilot and you've given yourself enough sleep opportunity, that you may just be able to wake up. The dream and the hope is that you're just able to wake up by yourself without any input from an alarm clock. However, for some people who need to wake up early in the morning, that's just a necessity. They have to wake up earlier than their body would naturally allow them to. And for those people, there are really interesting alarm clocks, some that are on your phone, and that's keeping your phone on the other side of the room. And it forces you to get up, activate your skeletal muscle, getting out of bed, and that itself triggers a state of awakeness. There are some really interesting alarm clocks that you can download as apps on your phone that you can set to say, this alarm will not stop ringing until I go to a totally different part of the house, take a picture of a particular object, and then the alarm turns off. That is something that I've not tried myself, but I know some people have benefited from. And you wonder if it takes that much effort to go somewhere else to take a picture of something totally different, then it's very likely you're going to stay awake from that point onward. There are some people have been asking about magnesium tablets here. Now, I suspected this question would come up, and because I get it asked it all the time. Um, Again, I want to first say that your sleep should be automatic. If you are relying on something external, for example, magnesium, there's probably further work that needs to be done in terms of sleep hygiene, the uh, training up your circadian system, getting lots of quality light, getting moving during the daytime. However, if you are finding magnesium to be helpful, there is unlikely a problem with using it. It is not advised that everyone needs to be taking magnesium for sleep. There are some studies that show a modest benefit for those who may have insomnia, and that can show that overall sleep quality, onset to sleep can slightly be improved. But the evidence is a little bit mixed on this, and the suggestion has been that magnesium is really only really appropriate if you have a clear magnesium deficiency, which you shouldn't if you have a really well balanced, varied diet. Okay. Um, What are your top tips for a pre-bedtime routine that may set us up for a good night's sleep, e.g., a hot bath? Yeah, well, look, you already touched on one of the things that's got a lot of evidence. This brings us to that buffer zone, really. So, you may have submitted this question before we talked about the buffer zone, but the buffer zone is exactly that. The buffer zone is these enjoyable activities, something that are relaxing, enjoyable, and that can include watching TV. Yep, I'm going to say it again. That can include watching TV. There is this idea that you are not allowed to have any screens. You are not allowed to look at your phone, to look at an iPad, to look at a TV screen. We try and minimize screens, but it's not for the reason that often gets reported out there. The reason is not to minimize harmful light from screens, because we found that actually doesn't have a huge impact on delaying sleep. The way to ease into sleep is to do something relaxing, something that your body can say, oh, I think it's about to, it's time to sleep soon. I'm getting into my pajamas. I'm brushing my teeth. I'm having my nice lemon and ginger tea. I think sleep's about to come. I'm doing all the things that I would usually do in the lead up to sleep. So even if it's the wrong time, there is this idea, for example, if you are a shift worker and you need to get to sleep at a different time that you otherwise would be, and you unfortunately don't have the regularity, if you build in a pre-sleep bedtime routine, there is this possibility that your body can actually sense that alone and say, oh, I'm doing all the right things in the lead up to bedtime. I think it's about time that I get to bed. And so that supports your sleep as well. Mentioned warm bath. There is beautiful evidence to say that when we get into a hot or a warm bath for a good prolonged amount of time, 20, 30 minutes, what that does is allows blood to flow to our hands and feet and allows our core body temperature to cool down once we've gotten out of the bath. And that effective cooling down of our body temperature is something else that sends us nicely into sleep and supports our function of our circadian rhythm. Um, any advice on how to best to wake yourself up in the morning? I think we've talked about that in terms of, the system should run itself, but these effective alarm clocks can be really helpful. Another really effective strategy, from multiple angles, is getting straight out of your front door, getting outside, getting into the fresh, cold air, even if it's not quite bright outside yet, and being able to be outside for 10, 15 minutes, getting your skeletal muscle activated, getting fresh air into your lungs, being in a totally different environment. And as the sun rises, you're going to get that early morning hit of natural daylight, which is incredibly powerful. Um, a few questions here, a little bit personal to individual circumstances, so I won't sort of talk about those. My 16-year-old daughter woke this morning after a long sleep, told me that she felt more tired than after the nights she stays up late. Is there any truth in this? Yes. Well, there are two aspects to your question. One is that she had a long sleep, and one is that she typically stays up late. Now, interestingly, teenagers do have a naturally delayed sleep chronotype, which means that their sleep phase, they're more likely and it's more appropriate for them to be falling asleep closer to midnight, for example, and waking up closer to 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, which is clearly not always what our sleep schedules allow. But there is this idea that actually the body clock of those who are teenagers is different compared to those who are young children or for adults who are in the working world. So we need to have a bit of sympathy for our teenage children and teenagers around us to understand that their bodies just function differently. We're going to do one more question. I think we've just got time for one more question. Let me see. Okay. Let's let's go with this. I'm a light sleeper and my partner is the opposite. Is there a way of becoming a less light sleeper? So our lightness or our strength of being a light or a good sleeper is unique to you a little bit. It's unique to your genetics, it's unique to your circumstances, what you've got going on in your life, but it's also unique to your life stage. So we see for those who are in older age, they do tend to have a lot more light sleep. They don't enter those really, really deep stages of sleep quite as well as you would do in your younger years. What we have to acknowledge is that many of us have bed partners, and that is means that our sleep is not just about us. Our partners may be snoring, that may be disrupting us. The temperature that our partners may prefer may be not what we would prefer. And so there are environmental factors here about saying potentially sleeping with a different blanket if yours is overheating you, using earplugs. Um, Sometimes that's about getting into bed earlier or later than a bed partner. Although the reality of that is that we shouldn't put sleep above everything else. The intention of sleep is to serve us. The intention of sleep is to allow us to live our lives. And I guess this is what I want to end with really is that we can make all sorts of recommendations around sleep. We can say this is why it's so important. This is what you need to do. This is how to support your sleep. But at the end of the day, why do we sleep? I said we don't know, but we do know. We sleep to wake. We sleep to live our lives. We sleep to be able to have meaningful relationships with those around us, to do good work, to contribute to society, to have a sense of well-being and purpose. And this is what this whole week is about at Rail Wellbeing Live. And so, really, if you make adjustments to your sleep, think about the impact it's going to have on you overall. Is that a net benefit impact? or is it a net negative impact? And always assess. If it means staying up an extra half an hour, 40 minutes in order to have precious quality time with your spouse or your partner, then do it. That would be my suggestion. Any medical problems, of course, go and see your doctor. And I think we'll end it there.